I did a video on this a while back, and my opinions are always changing, my thoughts are always changing, I'm always getting new information, and I think it's something that we need to talk about. And I think that the way things are changing, the way things that are coming up, it's something that we should all be aware of when it comes to not only UFO encounters, alien encounter, cryptozoological encounters, and Bigfoot encounters, but how we look at the whole paranormal world. And I will say, in the past, if somebody was a Bigfoot researcher or enthusiast or had an encounter and wanted to know more information, and they started talking about UFOs, that they were often shunned and pushed out, and, oh, those are the real weirdos, we're into hard fact science, Bigfoot research, this is a flesh and blood creature, it is an undiscovered primate of some kind, this is purely scientific, and UFOs and aliens and all that kind of stuff is complete hogwash. Well, it's kind of turned around, it's kind of come the other way, and I've got good contacts in the UFO world. I know quite a few of those guys, and I find it fascinating. And it's really kind of come around in the last few years. I mean, even 5-10 years ago, like I said, one really wouldn't talk to the other person was really shunned, and I don't think that that's fair, because I think there's so much commonality between what Bigfoot, people who haven't encountered Bigfoot, people who have had sightings of Bigfoot, people who have been face-to-face and interacted with them, and there's a lot of psychology, and there's a lot of events and things that happen to them that's very similar to what people report when they're contacted by aliens, or if not even aliens, just UFOs, as in the sense of an unidentified flying object, or they saw a craft that maybe didn't look like or behave like any modern aircraft, whether it be helicopter or fixed-wing aircraft, and it's not explainable. So when we talk about this, I will say there are some reports, some really out there reports, and what we also have to consider that both people in the Bigfoot world, when they get too close to Sasquatch, when they have really good proof or maybe even possibly shoot one, or people who are abducted by aliens or have really good proof or footage or something that proves, or they have information on the UFO phenomenon, they get approached by a man in black. Very similar to what Bigfoot people also get encountered. And I think that's interesting how they're both seem to be some kind of a cover-up, somebody out there, some entity, some organization trying to cover up the truth. Now, in the Bigfoot world, it's supposed to be kind of a good cop, bad cop kind of a thing, and in the UFO world, it's kind of a men in black type thing. But all across the United States, people are seeing Bigfoots. People see them every day. People have them on their property. People see them running across the roads. People have very benign encounters. People have violent encounters. And in all these encounters, stories come out of some very fantastical things. Bigfoot cloaking, Bigfoot having glowing red eyes. Now, I don't mean eye shine. I mean they're actively glowing like two red lights. Bigfoot doing other strange things, being able to mind speak. And then when you look at Missing 411 and some of the missing people across the United States, and you look at the sightings maps, these are not unlike some of the things that, people report about aliens, how they just appeared in their room, they suddenly appeared on a spacecraft, they saw these craft and these beings do strange things that go against the laws of physics. And now, I'm not going to venture out there and say that Bigfoot is an alien, because we simply don't know that. But that's something that some people have postulated and said that maybe that's the reason for the cover-up, is that they are something unnatural. And if you look at the sightings maps, here we have one of the USA, and, it's very obviously at population centers. You have to have mountainous areas and areas for where they could get away with it, and areas from where they could hide. And also some of these remote areas, often in desert, you also get UFO encounters. And I don't think that that's a coincidence. I think when you also look at other things like Skinwalker Ranch, and what's been brought to my attention that I can't necessarily talk about all the details, but these areas of high strangeness seem to be everywhere. And they seem to have periods of dormancy, periods of activity. Now, some people said that these are portals to another dimension, and people have seen Bigfoot-like creatures come through them, and also people have postulated that maybe aliens are more interdimensional or extra-dimensional, coming from another dimension, or this is their way, maybe not necessarily able to come from other stars flying directly at us, but because that would take a long time, even at the speed of light. Maybe they have some way of finding a wormhole and jumping through realities. And maybe sometimes these Bigfoot creatures or other creatures come through these portals. Or very on the surface of it, if you look at aliens, the possibility of aliens existing, like all the stories of them abducting people, maybe they see Sasquatch in the woods and they think, well, this is another type of people, because maybe they're abducting cows and doing experiments on people. Why wouldn't they want to abduct a Sasquatch and figure out what these things are about? And there are also different theories about some of these spacecraft, when they come through these portals, that they're maybe using Bigfoot as like a spy or something. They're using some kind of mind control. There are Bigfoot stories about people who have been habituated with them, saying that when the Bigfoot reach a certain age that they go with the star people. I've heard that in a couple different very kind of out there stories, but nonetheless they're reports of people who had very strong ties to a Bigfoot clan or family, and their family had ties with them, and they realized at a certain age what their description was, the star people or aliens would take them away and bring them back. And I know that sounds incredible, but it's certainly a fascinating story. If you wanted a very stealthy spy to live on the edge of human society and maybe be able to grant them or possess them or give them some kind of an ability to hide and move around and live off land, live off nature, hunt and survive, and be kind of the most self-sufficient drone you've ever seen, maybe that's one possibility. One of the other things for Bigfoot is we seem to have such a variety. Now, one of the things that I'm fairly well known for is my 10 types of Bigfoot, which is a branching off of the 4 types of Bigfoot, the type 1 being a big patty type, the type 2 that you see in the middle there being very chimpanzee-ish, a little smaller, a little more aggressive, typically seen in the south. The type 3, the gugwe type with a snout, very big overgrown baboonish, but these are very rare, and they're kind of along between the Mississippi and Missouri River, and then there being more of a relic hominid type that there's a lot of similarities to the great ape species, a striking amount, almost like maybe there was, and some people guess, that there was a true blood Bigfoot, ones that were here natively and been a long time, and some other type that had been manipulated. And for what reason and for what cause, I don't know. But when they bear an uncanny resemblance to overgrown humans and to different great ape species, and kind of makes you wonder, why is that? Would natural processes of evolution and separation and divergent evolution create these type of things, or is there some more of a design to it? Now, some people blame the government, but I think our government hasn't really been around long enough, so I think you have to look at other species if they would be indeed responsible for it. Also, some of the very controversial Bigfoot DNA evidence, if you're a proponent of that, a Melba Ketchum study and some of the other ones, is that they are half human and half something else. Well, that was just one particular type that got sampled. Maybe the other ones are a little more true blood or pureborn, and other ones are more genetically manipulated. This is just one sample of one type of one questionable report. But if it wasn't us that did it, if it wasn't mankind that did it, or if it wasn't mankind in any kind of modern sense, because people have been seeing Sasquatch for thousands of years and seeing these varieties of them for a long, long time, maybe it is some other kind of outside influence. And then you also got to think about some of these other creatures people are seeing in the woods, like this strange rake creature people are seeing more and more, like all the time. I'm getting more and more reports, people telling me about them. Now, to me, these things always struck me as more demonic, and maybe there's a connection to aliens there. I know some people think aliens are really more demonic, but if they're using these portals to travel across time, to travel across space, Maybe they're bringing stuff with them intentionally, unintentionally. Maybe there's different dimensions, and some of these creatures come from different dimensions. Maybe these creatures themselves have the ability to open and close portals or vortexes. That's kind of a theory. But when you just look at the strangeness of what people are seeing and cryptozoology, here's a very frightening picture of a gugwi. It seems like nature comes up with some pretty horrifying things, but to have an 8, 9, 10 foot tall man-like creature with long claws and sharp fangs and a protruding snout that with a very, very bad distemper, this almost goes beyond what you would expect nature or God or whatever belief system you have for our creation to come up with. And to the fact that this was somebody trying to make a soldier, either in modern times or millennia ago, to protect something, I think more than just wild crossbreeding. And I think a lot of times when you get into the alien theory, possibly as our creators and possibly maybe having involvement with ancient civilizations here on Earth, I mean, that's a real possibility. I mean, one of the strangest ones out there that's very popular these days and a lot of people are seeing are the Dogman. Where did these things come from? There are some theories out there that maybe like an ancient Atlantean type civilization or Sumerians came up with the Bigfoots as a laborer, and the Dogmans are like a guardian of certain areas. And then there's areas of high strangeness, areas with portals that seem to have lots of Bigfoot activity and then other things around there at the same time. It almost seems to me that the Bigfoots are trying to throw acorns and trying to knock on trees and trying to scare us away from certain spots and certain areas, because maybe what we think of as aliens or extraterrestrials or UFOs and some of these bright lights and orbs are coming through these portals, and then maybe some other creatures come and go. And I've heard reports even out there being good portals where benign creatures and benevolent creatures come through, and then bad portals where things like the Rake come through. And maybe Bigfoot and Dogman are kind of these sentient earth creatures that are here to guard, protect, maybe keep things at bay, but they're still able to defend themselves and live on their own. Maybe they have some kind of advanced directive we don't know about. Or maybe they're just some kind of pre-human, some kind of Neanderthal blend with humans that the aliens tampered with, and from time to time they come and check on their experiment, and they abduct them the same way they abduct us. Because for me, as time goes on, Sasquatch is more and more human in their activities, the way they conduct themselves, the way they do things, other than their beastly hairy giant appearance. And then people want to think of giants in biblical sense. I'm just saying giant as in something large. And then you got to think, well, who created us? Where did we come from? Is it God as we know it, made in his image? Is it somebody pretending to be God? Is it, are there ancient aliens involved? Were we created in God's image perfectly and something manipulated us? Especially when you look at different versions of us and earlier things, like the Cro-Magnons, going all the way back to our fossil record to the Australopithecines and Homo habilis and Homo erectus and Neanderthals. And then you look at Sasquatch, and it kind of makes you wonder who's pulling the strings. Is there some kind of genetic manipulation? Where does God fit into all this? And those are some really big questions. But when people say, hey, I saw a bright light in the sky in an alien craft, and then I saw Bigfoot appear, or when people say, hey, or when you hear abduction reports of someone being on a spacecraft and the next table next to him being examined is a Bigfoot, I've heard stuff like that before too. And I don't know, is it something, like rudimentary, like I said, where they're just abducting them the same way they abduct us because they're curious about life on Earth, or is it something much deeper and sinister? There's so many questions that we don't know. But when somebody necessarily brings up UFOs and wants to tie them in with Sasquatch, I am not against it. I think that they are all part of the bigger mystery here, and I think there is a reason why the government's trying to cover this up. I think they're all intrinsically linked, and I think they're all kind of under the same umbrella. The same way you could probably tie ghost and demonic possession and all that other kind of stuff into this too. So I just wanted to thank you guys. I know this was a bit of a rant, and a bit of a stream of consciousness type thing. But I really do think there's something going on between these bright lights in the woods, the orbs, the UFOs people see in the sky, aliens as people report them, government bases, and then Sasquatch, these strange beasts that people see in the woods that are very human but aren't humans. So let me know what you guys think in the comments. If you like what you see here, please hit subscribe. Please give this video a thumbs up. It really helps us out. And stay safe in the woods, folks. Good evening. Tonight we have a few spooky stories I wanted to share with you folks. I have 3 stories. One of them I heard years ago from an old co-worker. The other 2 were more recently in the last couple years. I've all heard them firsthand from the people who reported them. Now I will say, trying not to embellish or add anything to these stories, I'm trying to give them to you pretty much exactly as I heard them. But I will say I've changed the locations and names and maybe condense some events that happened over months. But for the most part, these stories are 100% true. I believe the people who told them. The people expressed fear. And I wanted to share them with you folks tonight to get us to kind of in the Halloween mood, more or less. So the first story was Bill. I talked to Bill a little over a year ago. And what's very striking is this story is very similar to some older stories that I had heard on Sasquatch Chronicles, and he had no idea what that was. He wasn't a Bigfoot researcher, but he wasn't stupid. He realized that him and his wife had bought this old farm property in the Deep South. The lady who had it before him, she lived there for a couple months on her home and then went into like a hospice type care. I guess she went downhill really fast after her husband died. And when she left the house pretty much immediately, this older lady. Dishes in the sink, stuff still in the refrigerator, fully furnished, packed up some clothes in a suitcase and had her kids come pick her up. And her kid said that she was starting to get Alzheimer's and she lived out her life in an assisted living place and passed away. The kids all lived very far away. So this farmhouse in the property became very dilapidated, and Bill and his wife bought it. They wanted it as a fixer-up program. Bill is a professional. He works late nights, and he was still working. This was at the end of his career, but he figured he'd spend the last couple of years of his life commuting and working late. His kids were grown and out of the house, so it was just him and his wife ready to enjoy the simple life in a farmland and pretty much enjoy their retirement. So Bill immediately started noticing this was a strange property. The barn had, big items in it tipped over, and he couldn't explain how some of these items had been moved. There were also lots of stick structures around the house that he was finding, stuff that looked like blinds all around the property for watching the house. And he was hearing tree knocks. He was hearing strange whoops that didn't sound like any birds he had ever heard before. And he would swear he'd get the feeling of being watched when he was out there all the time. The hair would stand up on his neck. So he would also be doing a lot of work in this barn. There was a tractor and some farm equipment and stuff in there, and he had to get all the farm equipment running so he could cut the grass, work on the road that was in there. He generally just had a lot of work to do. His wife was very helpful. But he was still working. He was still working swing shifts in the occasional graveyard. So he would come home late, sleep in, get up in the afternoon, and work. It was about this time, after a few weeks, his wife was getting creeped out there by herself, and she knew how to use guns, and she was no pushover, but he got a couple of German Shepherds, I believe. I believe that's the type of dog he said. I think he said German Shepherds. He kind of said more or less police dogs. They could have been Belgian Malinois. Anyway, so he got a couple of dogs, well-trained dogs. He had, Bill was pretty well off, so he was able to afford some of those really well-trained dogs that you see out there as companions for his wife. And this made her feel a lot better because they would always be on high alert. They were, very quickly bonded to her and were always her protectors. So it was a few weeks later, after he got the dogs, and he was getting used to having the dogs around, letting them out, and, they're pretty rambunctious, so on and off the leash training, that kind of stuff. But there really wasn't a whole lot else for them around except, deers and bushes and everything else. And speaking of deer, there were a lot of deer on the property, and he would occasionally find them dead at the edge of the property. And what he described was it looked like their necks were completely twisted around, or sometimes he'd find the head twisted off and find it 30, 40 feet away from the rest of the corpse. And the carcass would usually have its guts missing or pulled out, but like they were gone, but the meat and everything was there, and it looked like it wasn't done by scavengers. It looked like something, surgically extracted the guts, removed or ate the guts without a lot of mess. And he just found that was very odd. And, he did see the occasional coyote and things, but it was just generally very weird around the property. So one week, his wife was gone for a week visiting her sister, and he was working by himself, and he had the dogs out with him. He was going in and out of the barn and working on an old tractor, and quite often he would work late into the afternoon, and his wife would call his name, Bill, dinner's ready, Bill. So it was very odd one day that he finished working and was back in the house and was out on the porch. He grabbed a beer, sat down out there, and was kind of just enjoying the evening, and he hears a sound. And he hears a couple other sounds coming from the bushes. And when he stopped and heard it, he heard Bill. And it almost sounded like a wife's voice. And he described it as in the biggest, toughest dude you've ever seen in your life. Like Andre the Giant trying to do an impression of his wife's voice, calling his name. And it was coming from the tree line. Well, he hopped up, grabbed his shotgun. It was dusk. He had a flashlight. And he kind of went out there to go investigate. The dogs that were always very on point, chasing everything, were very much cowering by his side and kind of whimpering. They were very much scared of what was going on. Now, Bill was no dummy. He kind of had a feeling that from what he had been seeing, what he had been hearing, that maybe there were Sasquatch on the property. He wasn't closed-minded to it. He was actually kind of fine with it. He didn't really care. Up until this point, they weren't really bothering him. He kind of had a suspicion. But he went out to go investigate his name calling because he thought, this has got to be somebody screwing with me. This isn't Bigfoot. Is this place haunted? And as he's going to the tree line, he stops. He gets hit with this wall of fear about 30 or 40 feet from the tree line. And he hears a knock behind him, like a tree knock, coming from, kind of like 170 or 180 degrees away from where the voices were calling him. And he turns around and he sees a giant Sasquatch standing in the darkness of this tree line. It ducks behind a tree. Just at this point, he hears another tree knock from across the yard, and he sees movement on the other side of the yard. He hears something else calling his name, and he felt that was something sending a message that you're not welcome here, or that it was an ambush. And he can only just imagine his wife being there by himself. At this point, he backed up to the house. And apparently his wife, when he had been gone, had similar circumstances of hearing her name or the dog's name being called out there, and all sorts of weird hoops and hollers and the 800-pound owl thing. And it started off as mundane curiosity, and these Sasquatch slowly got more and more aggressive, looking in their windows, thumping on the house. It seems like the more he cut the yard and the more they cleaned the place up and the more work they did and the more lights they put out, the more aggressive these creatures became. So eventually they couldn't take it anymore. They didn't think anybody was going to believe them. Bill, still having a professional career, just said that country life wasn't working out for him and his wife, and they sold the property. And he came across my channel a while ago, and he wanted to share that story with me. And it always really stuck with me. I can just kind of imagine it. As somebody who spends time in the woods at an older property, I just picture it in my mind, and I wanted to share that first story with you guys. The second story I want to share with you folks tonight was by my old coworker John. This was probably shared with me in 2007 or so. And he was in the military. He was still active at the time, getting ready to retire. And he was lifelong military. He'd been in for 25 years or something like by that point. He was working graveyard with me in security. And he said he was stationed at a military base. I believe it was on the East Coast somewhere, kind of further south. And when he was a young man, I believe he might not even have been like 20 or 21 years old. Anyway, he was stationed on this base. It was kind of out in the country. It was kind of a little more of a remote base, and there was a small town nearby. He said he didn't have a car at the time, but he would go for long walks. He would walk into town, have dinner, get a couple drinks, go to the store, and walk back to the base. He says it was very common for a lot of these guys. So one night, he got out there a little bit later than usual, and he was like, oh crap, it's dark. So he started off when it was just getting dark, and by the time he was on his way back to the base, I guess it was a good few miles. And all along the road going back to the base was this tree line. It was kind of trees on either side. It was kind of your classic, 2-lane blacktop with a ditch, and then about, 15, 20 feet, and then trees. And this was your classic East Coast, really dense kind of woods. And he's walking along this road, and he can hear something in the tree line. And he's like, oh, it's probably a deer. It's nighttime. And although the crickets, he says it was very eerily quiet. He said, normally when he's out in this area, he hears crickets, he hears raccoons, he hears all sorts of stuff rustling around in the bushes. And he says it was eerily quiet this night, except for something that was kind of going, he kept hearing periodically off to his right. And he would kind of look over, and before you know it, he's kind of walking more on the left side of the road because this noise is following him. And he starts walking a little faster, and this noise is following him, and it sounds like it's on 2 feet. And whatever it is, it's sounding really big. And he could hear the occasional branch snap, and then he would hear it stop for a second, then he would hear thump, 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 like it was running to catch up. And then at a certain point, he's walking really fast, not wanting to jog because he's got kind of his heart's beating, but he knows if he runs, he doesn't want to trigger anything. He doesn't think it's a bear. He doesn't think it's a human because no human could run through these woods at night. I mean, during the day, you would be, hard-pressed to move this thing. But whatever it is, it's big, and it's following him. So at one point, he hears the footsteps go from the bushes behind him to what sounds like grass, and then the gravel, and then he hears footsteps run across the road. Just as he turns around, he doesn't have a flashlight or anything on him. He says it's really dark, but there is some moonlight, and he can kind of see what's going on. So just as he sees through the moonlight, he can kind of barely make out the figure of a person running across the road. The thing is, this person was huge. Very broad shoulders, much taller than him, moved incredibly smooth like a ghost. It was like a black blur headed through the night. This huge, upright, walking blur ran behind him. He caught just a glimpse of it, and he could hear it skitter off into the gravel and then back into the woods on the other side of the road. At this point, John told me that he was in a full panic and that he was in pretty much a jog headed back to the base. This was a while back. He didn't have a flashlight or a phone or anything on him. And he started with a trot up to the gate of the military base. And right as he did, the guard at the military base, who he recognized and knew, he held out his ID and said, "Hey, I'm coming back in." And the guard from the military base pulled out his service rifle, pointed it towards the bushes, and said, "You didn't see anything tonight. You best be getting back to your barracks." He showed him his ID, which the guy didn't even look at, he said, and he went back to his barracks and had a very unrestless night. And I just thought it was very fascinating. Now, he tells me in retrospect that he thinks it might have been a Bigfoot. I think it might even have been a dog man. But yeah, that's very frightening. The fact that when the guard or the person manning the front gate had his rifle pointed as soon as he came running in and saw what was going on and told him, "You didn't see anything tonight," made it really sound like he knew what was going on. And he didn't ask any further questions. He didn't bring it up. But he definitely didn't go walking into town by himself anymore. It had been a long night for Chris. It had been a long day. He had been working all day. He had to drive up the hill to the mountains where his house was. And he was unloading the car. He made a little dinner. And he went back outside because it was just such a nice warm summer night. In the mountains, you got a little bit of crisp air coming in. And he sat on the tailgate of his truck, having a cigarette. And what he noticed across the road, across the street from him, absolutely dumbfounded Chris. He saw what looked like something about the size of a beach ball, but all white, and had kind of a yellowish white light coming from it, just like this orb of light, like somebody carrying a beach ball very smoothly right through the trees, right along the side of the road in a little mountain community that he lived in. He didn't know what it was. He was blinking his eyes. He could see it clearly, but he wasn't sure. Am I looking at a headlight or a reflection? I don't know what that is. I don't know what's going on. As soon as this light passed away, he noticed a very large creature come up right the same path that this light was coming up. He sat there dumbfounded at the light, watching this huge, giant, hairy figure that he could only describe as a Sasquatch, trotting behind the same path that this orb of light had taken. It moved over, took a quick glance over at him, and kept moving very smoothly, very quickly through these trees, barely making a sound. At this point, Chris was quite taken back. Not only did he see a Sasquatch, which isn't completely uncommon in the mountain community where he was in, but he saw this strange orb of light. And there are many stories that are connected like this, which is why I think Chris's story is really incredible. And I completely believe him, but fortunately he did get ridiculed quite a bit for this story. And you never know what's going on with the paranormal. You never know how these different subjects tie together. And if you like what you hear, please give this video a thumbs up. It helps me out a lot. Please hit subscribe if you haven't already. We've kind of slowed down how many videos we're putting out, but at least once a week you guys will have something to watch and listen to. Thank you very much. Stay safe in the woods. And if you got a Bigfoot encounter you want to share with me, email me at mattsquatchpresents@gmail.com. And always keep your eyes out, folks. Good evening. I wanted to speak to you folks tonight about conspiracy theories. Especially 3 conspiracy theories that I'm asked about a lot. My thoughts, they come up. People send me links all the time. And quite honestly, these are 3 conspiracy theories that have, I believe, some basis of truth and some evidence to them. And I just personally don't believe, or I think it's a bit of a stretch. And also, you're fully entitled to believe in whatever you want. I fully respect that. It's a free country. I believe in free world and free thought. If you think the world functions a certain way, or you believe something's going on and you like it and you're 100% invested in it, God bless you. I believe in your right to think that. I'm not here to change your minds or sway you. These are just for my personal reasons, and I'll explain some of them. I don't believe in these theories. One of them is flat Earth. I do not like flat Earth theory. No, it's not because I'm addicted to the modern science books. I think on my channel repeatedly, and I know I'm getting heat for this stuff from people that won't even watch the whole video, but because I ask people to believe in an ape in the woods kind of a thing in North America that's undiscovered. So I get it, but at the same time, in my shooting experience, land navigation experience, my very limited astronomy stuff when it comes to lunar eclipses and solar eclipses and how the stars move, and the Coriolis effect, like I said, in shooting, the rotation of the Earth of an object moving through the air and how that's corresponded to it and how that functions, and just basic land navigation of points, kind of how if you're going to fly from LA to Japan, you're going to go so far west that you're going to end up east. And I know there are explanations for this stuff. I have listened to a number of podcasts, watched a bunch of videos, and I will give Flat Earth, at the very least, it's interesting. It's fun to challenge how we perceive these things. But in the end, I don't believe it. Especially when you look at all the other celestial bodies and everything else being sphere-like. And no, I know the Earth isn't a perfect sphere. It's actually, I don't forget the term of it, but it's a little bit bigger in the middle than it is at tops, just because of the pulls and gravitational effects stretch the Earth a tiny bit. And people have sent me photos and things, and it's kind of always the same. Oh, this is from, 40 kilometers up, 120,000 miles up, and you can't see the curve of the earth and that kind of thing. And there's always clouds, or the camera's not level, or it's a different aspect ratio. Somebody has stretched that image, maybe intentionally or unintentionally. And I've talked to pilots, I've talked to people who have been really high up there, not civilian pilots, but military pilots, who have told me that they've seen the curve of the earth, that they've seen the edge of space, and they've talked to other people, and I fully believe them. And like I said, just from the land navigation, the other things I've done, it just doesn't make sense to me. So I know people are going to leave me links in the comments. Go right ahead. I probably won't click on them. But I've done a lot of research into flat Earth. It is certainly interesting, but it's not necessarily something that I believe. So the second one that I have a hard time buying is the whole chemtrails thing, where the government is constantly bombarding us, or some nefarious organization, with chemicals, for MK Ultra, mind control, to keep population depressed, to keep our air polluted or whatever. And that there's just an endless cycle of civilian, commercial, and military aircraft always in the skies, subjecting us to stuff for some nefarious reason. Now, do I believe that the government might subject a population to some chemical or some substance, maybe to test its positive or negative effects? Absolutely. I believe it happens all the time. And that's the problem with a lot of these conspiracy theories. Is there some kind of shred of truth or some little bit of evidence or some things that sound plausible, then they stretch it to the realm that I personally don't believe. If you know how modern aircraft control works, you have, I don't know the exact numbers, but I know that, at 25,000 feet you have a plane, 30,000 feet you have another plane, 35,000 feet you have another plane. And they separate it so these planes don't crash into each other. If they have a problem, they have an area to turn and dive and gain altitude, and that's modern air traffic control. It's not like a highway system where we're all in the same plane and, you have to stop and wait for the other system. You have to wait for the other one. So they basically just have varying stacks. And as our population increases and grows, air travel is becoming more and more important, more and more prevalent, and there's just more planes in the air than there ever have been before. And especially with contrails, which is just a vapor trail left by jet engines at a high altitude, because jet engines put out a lot of heat. Altitude can be cold, especially here on the West Coast. If you don't have any wind, you maybe have it lower down on the ground, but you don't have any wind up in the atmosphere, those trails will stay for a long time. Like I said, and there have been, fully documented and publicly known where they, spray pesticides or a certain chemical or something over an area, or they seed clouds or something like that. But do I think that there's just hordes and fleets of planes out there that are spreading chemicals? Absolutely not. I think it's all just contrails. I think there are more planes than ever before, which is why we see them more and more. And I think to have that many pilots, co-pilots, engineers, that many planes that would have very obvious tanks of chemicals strapped to them, the manufacturers of these chemicals would have to be in the hundreds of millions of gallons to spread over these large areas. To keep all that a secret, I think would be very, very hard. If you look at the UFO and Bigfoot and other conspiracies, there's a lot of whistleblowers on it. And I haven't heard very many, if anybody at all. I mean, they're probably out there, of whistleblowers on this. And like I said, I do think that maybe some organizations might be subjecting people to this something sometimes. I don't think they're doing it all the time. And finally, the other conspiracy theory that I necessarily don't buy is that we faked the moon landing. One of the big popular ones is that Stanley Kubrick, because of his work on 2001: A Space Odyssey, was hired by NASA because it wasn't feasible for us to go to the moon, or it wasn't actually going to happen, or it wasn't possible, whatever reason. And then that when he directed, The Shining, there's all these moon landing references and everything else, and it was kind of his apology and symbolism. While Kubrick is a master director and certainly when it comes to movies, one of the biggest perfectionists out there. And if anybody was going to do a subliminal message in his movie, it was going to be Kubrick. Who knows? I think we went to the moon. I think we were asked to leave by an alien race. I think there's a lot more going on with the moon than we know about. And this is one of those little caveats. I do think that maybe some photos and some footage might have been faked or reenacted or heavily edited or cropped out. And oh, how come you don't see stars kind of thing? Well, it's because you can either focus on something in the foreground or background. It's very hard to, unless you're using some kind of trick photography to do deep focus where the foreground and the background are in the same focus. Not impossible, but it's hard, especially when you're on the moon and you have, at this time, 50, 60-year-old pieces of camera equipment trying to be operated with gloves. We're lucky we got the nice clear images that we did from the moon. And, if you want to get out there into maybe the moon as some kind of a satellite for alien bases, or we were asked to leave, or there's something else going on, I believe that. I mean, it seems a lot more even plausible to me. But did we fake the moon landing? No, I think we went. I think we went multiple times. And I think information we got is heavily redacted. And that's basically how I feel about the moon landing. I think that we went, and it was incredibly hard. And the amount of people it would take from all the people in mission control, from all the, even people who are janitors and electricians and everything working in mission control, to all the hundreds of thousands of engineers out there, to all the people involved, it would just be such a monumental task to try to get that many people to keep quiet about it. And I think you'd have more whistleblowers and more deathbed confessions. Like, I know there's a couple. Plus, the astronauts themselves, you talk to a lot of astronauts and they're like, oh yeah, we went to the moon, we've been to space, but UFOs are real. I'm reminded, I forget the name of the guy who, the first guy to orbit the backside of the moon, the dark side of the moon, he came back around and he said, NASA, it's beautiful, and by the way, Santa Claus is real. And everybody in the control room got a chuckle. Well, Santa Claus is often one of the things that they use as kind of a hidden term for UFOs. Hey, we saw Santa Claus on the way in here. So if someone overhears it, they think you're joking or kidding. So I fully believe that there's this stuff going on with the moon that they don't want us to know about. And maybe that's why some pieces of the of footage and some photographs might have been faked or touched up. But I think, yes, we did in fact go to the moon. And that's pretty much how I feel about the moon landing hoax theory. There are a lot of other bad theories out there that I don't like. But there's a lot of good theories out there too. Well, not necessarily good, but I think more interesting. Like, I wouldn't waste your time with these theories. I would really try to figure out what happened on 9/11, the real reasons why we went to Iraq, what happened to all that money that the Pentagon lost that was discussed on September 10th, 2001. The giants, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, all these chimera creatures, genetic experiments. I think there's so much better, more interesting stuff out there than a lot of these super common kind of conspiracy theories. That being said, you're all welcome to your opinion. You can believe whatever you want. And I think even if it's something like me, where I don't necessarily believe it, I think it's still fascinating to hear about and read about and have others' perspectives on it. So stay safe in the woods and always watch the skies, folks.
The N9 is one of South Africa's longest roads, running from the golden shores of the southern coast right up into the heart of the Northern Cape province. It is also home to one of the country's most famous ghostly apparitions. Join us as we take a ride with the Uniondale Hitchhiker. The storm had been coming down hard and heavy for the past few hours and showed no signs of abating. As torrential rain hammered down on the surface of the highway, a solitary motor vehicle battled its way through the horrendous conditions, headlights struggling to penetrate the relentless downpour. It was Easter weekend of 1968, and the car in question was a Volkswagen Beetle, driven by a young man named Gilles Pretorius. The unpredictable crosswinds and limited visibility made for difficult driving conditions, but as a corporal in the South African Army, Pretorius was no stranger to sticky situations. Had it been up to him, he would not have elected to make a car journey during the worst storm in living memory, but the reality was that he'd had little say in the matter. The young soldier turned for a moment to look back at the sleeping figure curled up on the tiny rear seats behind him, and allowed a contented smile to spread across his face. Maria Rue was the first woman he had ever truly loved, and the previous evening, she had agreed to marry him. Unfortunately, that agreement had come with the caveat that the happy couple would have to drive the 500-kilometre trip down to Riverdale to share the news with her parents in person. Still, Gilles reflected, in the grand scheme of things, this was an acceptable price to pay in return for spending the rest of his life with the woman he so adored. As he turned his attention back towards the highway, the car was suddenly buffeted to one side by an incoming blast of wind. Pretorius instinctively heaved on the steering wheel, attempting to counter a burgeoning sideways skid, but there was no response. His eyes widened in fear as he picked out the onrushing tree line. Then, there was darkness. Pretorius awoke some time later to find his clothes soaked from the rain pouring in through the car's now shattered windscreen. Blood was pouring down the side of his face from an injury to his temple. He called out for Maria, desperate for confirmation that she had not been badly hurt, but there was no response. Mustering the strength to haul himself out of the wrecked car, he found the rear seats empty. With the growing realization that Maria must have been thrown clear of the vehicle, he repeatedly cried out her name as the storm continued to rage around him. After some time spent fruitlessly searching the undergrowth, he staggered back up towards the highway, eventually collapsing into an exhausted heap at the side of the road. It would not be until well into the following afternoon that the broken and shattered remains of his fiancée were discovered by a local farmer. The coroner would later note in his report that Maria would have been unconscious at the time of her death and would not have felt any of the horrific injuries she had sustained. He could not have known it at the time, but these closing comments would not be the end of her tragic story. 8 years after the accident, a local youth by the name of Anton Lagrange set off from his home in Willowmore to attend a party in the neighbouring town of Uniondale. It had been an uneventful trip, but as he was approaching the outskirts of his destination, he caught sight of a solitary figure standing at the side of the carriageway up ahead. As he drew closer, he was able to make out that the lone pedestrian was female, less than appropriately dressed for the tumbling temperatures of the Easter weekend. It was this factor, along with the lack of other traffic on the road, which caused him to pull up alongside her and ask if she needed a lift into Uniondale. She nodded silently in assent before opening one of the rear doors and climbing into the back seat. As Anton pulled away, he spent the next few minutes attempting to strike up a conversation with the young woman, but it was to no avail. Growing slightly apprehensive at her complete lack of interaction, he eventually turned to face his passenger, only to find the back seat completely empty. One of only 2 officers on duty at the Uniondale police station that evening was Constable Snowy Potgieter, who was less than impressed when the hysterical Lagrange burst into his front office, claiming that he had just picked up a ghost on his way into town. After listening impassively to Anton's bizarre story, Potgieter asked him to drive back to the spot where he encountered the girl, whilst he followed behind him in a patrol car. With darkness now descending, the 2 vehicles had been travelling in convoy for a few minutes, when Potgieter witnessed the rear passenger door of Lagrange's car unexpectedly open. The young man slammed on his brakes and, exiting his vehicle, came running back towards the police car, yelling that the girl had suddenly reappeared, sitting on his back seat and staring at him in the rearview mirror. Beginning to suspect that he was the target of some juvenile prank, Potgieter told Lagrange to carry on driving. This time, however, he was asked to switch on his interior lights, so the police officer could see exactly what he was doing. The journey resumed, only for the same door to suddenly fly open a short distance along the road. As both cars screeched to a halt, Potgieter angrily exited his cruiser and stormed over to the car in front. Having satisfied himself that there was nobody else hidden inside Lagrange's vehicle, he was in the process of threatening the youngster with arrest when they both clearly heard the sound of an anguished female cry emanating from the tree line a short distance away. In an instant, Lagrange was back in his car and driving full pelt back towards Uniondale, the policeman following close behind. Back at the station, the bewildered Potgieter took a brief statement from Lagrange before sending the terrified teen on his way. It would not be until the following weekend that one of his colleagues had sought him out in relation to the report he had submitted. Constable Pat MacDonald had been among the first officers to reach the mangled Volkswagen Beetle 8 years previous, and told Potgieter that the description of the girl provided by Lagrange was an exact match for how Maria Rue had been dressed on that fateful Easter evening. 2 years later, another off-duty army corporal by the name of Davy van Jaarsveld was heading along the N9 towards Uniondale on his motorbike when he encountered a lone female hitchhiker. Accepting his offer of a lift, the girl silently climbed onto the back of the bike and donned the spare helmet that was handed to her. After about 3 kilometers, Van Jaarsveld felt the motorcycle jerk suddenly underneath him and immediately pulled over to ascertain what had happened. There was no sign of the girl, and the helmet she had been wearing was now securely strapped down, just as it had been several minutes before. 2 years on from this encounter, another motorcyclist, 20-year-old Andre Kurtzy, would have a decidedly unnerving experience. He had been travelling at speed along the N9, looking for a friend who had run out of fuel, when he had passed a young woman standing alone on the side of the road. Focused on finding his fellow biker, he had simply ignored her and continued on his way. Soon after, he had felt a sudden inexplicable tightness in his chest. Looking down, he could see a pair of feminine-looking arms wrapped firmly around his waist, and could feel a pressure on his back as if there was someone leaning against him from behind. Crying out in alarm, he accelerated up to 80 miles per hour in an attempt to shake off his unwanted passenger. Almost immediately, there was a violent blow to the back of his helmet, which almost caused him to lose his balance. Kurtzy continued to increase his speed and was struck 2 more times in the rear of his helmet. Finally, as the motorbike hit 100 miles per hour, the arms around his waist disappeared and the pressure on his back ceased. When Andre pulled over and dismounted his bike, there was no sign that anyone had been behind him. He proceeded straight to Uniondale to report the matter to the police. It was there, whilst he was recounting his tale, that one of the officers showed him a photograph from the old case file. On seeing the picture, the colour completely drained from Kurtzy's face. The girl he had passed, standing at the side of the road, had indeed been Maria Rue. The phenomenon known as the phantom hitchhiker has been reported in countries all over the globe, with stories of spirits allegedly haunting the world's highways and byways sharing a significant number of common features, regardless of where they may have originated from. In Switzerland, for example, it is said that a ghostly hitchhiker frequents the roads in the vicinity of the Belgian motorway tunnel near Basel. The local police department has received multiple reports over the years from drivers who have stopped to give an elderly woman a lift. Said to be dressed all in white, she apparently warns motorists of an unspecified impending disaster before disappearing from the vehicle. A similar woman in white is alleged to haunt White Rock Lake Park in Dallas, Texas. She has reportedly appeared to numerous witnesses along East Lawther Drive, completely soaked through, asking for a lift to her home. She is believed to be the ghost of a visitor to the lake who drowned in a boating accident at some point during the 1930s, and it is said that she leaves a waterlogged seat behind after she too vanishes from inside the car. In many of these cases, most notably those that have generated a high frequency of reported incidents, it is relatively easy to ascertain that they are nothing more than urban legends. In these instances, it proves impossible to identify any of the alleged witnesses, their identities conveniently withheld or forgotten by the storyteller, with the detail of the reported encounters becoming more elaborate and fantastic each time it is passed on. That said, there are equally as many cases, especially those which have been reported in more recent times, where identifiable witnesses are more than happy to go on record with what they have seen. And the existence of accompanying photographic or video evidence is also becoming more commonplace, where footage appears to show someone or something standing by the roadside, illuminated by the headlights of the approaching vehicle. Numerous reports exist of a phantom airman appearing on the roads leading up to RAF Lakenheath in Suffolk. During the course of his most notorious appearance, he apparently asked a military policeman who had picked him up from the roadside if he could have a light for his cigarette. When the driver passed a metal Zippo lighter back over his shoulder, he heard the familiar metallic sound of it being opened, struck and then closed, before the dull thud of it hitting the floor mats, as the ghostly passenger suddenly vanished. Dashcam footage purporting to show the airman circulated online in 2018. The video shows what appears to be the hazy outline of a figure dressed in what may be the distinctive blue uniform of an RAF serviceman, which then fades into a blur as the vehicle approaches. Similar footage also exists from the Philippines, which is alleged to show the figure of a small boy sitting on his own at the side of the road with his head in his hands, who disappears as a carload of students pass by. One of the hallmarks of the so-called phantom hitchhiker, which sets them aside from most other ghostly apparitions, is their apparent ability to physically interact with the living, often succeeding in passing themselves off as a living person until the point they disappear. They seem to be able to handle physical objects, maintain conversation with the driver, and often display an eagerness or strong desire to get to a specific location. Sometimes they even complete the journey in question. It has been theorized that in many of these cases, the spirit is either desperate to complete their final tragic journey, or may not even be aware that they are deceased. This is one of the explanations for the Maria Rue hauntings. Some observers have theorized that as she was fast asleep at the time she was killed, her consciousness was unable to fully comprehend that her physical body had been so quickly and cruelly taken from her. In some cases, the slightly unusual behaviour of the spectral passenger suggests that they are merely replaying their final journey and have no understanding of the time and events that have passed since they were killed. But in others, quite the opposite is true, with the hitchhiker displaying a clear desire for the driver to know something about them and the circumstances of their death before they fade away. There is a slightly sinister footnote to the Maria Rue haunting, which suggests that her spirit did indeed possess some degree of awareness of what had happened. The final recorded sighting of the Uniondale hitchhiker was in 1984, the year in which another significant incident would take place. After Maria's death, Shield Pretorius managed to find love once again and would go on to marry his new partner. In a sad twist of fate, he too would lose his life in 1984, killed in another tragic car accident. With her fiancé now joining her in the afterlife, it seems that whatever reasons Maria had for returning to the N9 highway passed on with him, and she was never seen again. Naturally, a certain percentage of reported incidents involving roadside apparitions can be attributed to driver fatigue or simple fabrication on the part of some of the people reporting them, but in the Uniondale hauntings, these explanations do not seem to marry up with what was being reported. None of the accounts feel too fantastical, and those coming forward had little to gain from sharing their testimony with the authorities. In addition to this, the evidence of Constable Snowy Potgieter in particular adds a compelling and disconcerting degree of weight to the story. An officer of the law would stand to gain nothing other than ridicule from his peers and superiors by coming forward and admitting to being involved in such an incident. In the end, the story of the Uniondale hitchhiker is one of tragedy, heartbreak and longing, rather than anything overtly sinister. If there is any positive to be taken from this story, it is that despite the saddening circumstances of her death, It seems that the spirit of Maria Rue found the closure she needed in order to break the cycle she had become trapped in. May she and Shield Pretorius now rest in peace together. Hi peeps, this week we're proud to present an exciting collaboration with one of the most well-known and respected channels of its type on YouTube. We can't emphasise just how much this channel inspired and motivated us to create Bedtime Stories, and even influenced many of our episode choices. Focusing on anything from fascinating historical facts and events to the strangest of paranormal and supernatural tales, they are counted among the very few who genuinely managed to creep us out. In the unlikely event that you are unfamiliar with this channel, please be sure to check it out after the episode. But for now, we're honoured to welcome the narrator and co-founder of Top Fives.
For centuries, regions in both South and Central America have been inundated with reports of sinister and mysterious flying entities who appear overhead without warning. They are described as wingless humanoids who descend silently from the above, often to attack innocent passers-by. This week, we are proud to present Terror from the Sky. The city of Santa Catarina in eastern Mexico possesses few claims to notoriety. Situated on the main route between Monterrey and Saldio, it was originally little more than a waypoint for wary travellers, but eventually expanded into a more permanent settlement as time passed by. In many ways, it's almost indistinguishable from many other Mexican town or city, and yet it appears to lie at the heart of an enduring and inexplicable mystery. One that continues to generate no small amount of fear and apprehension amongst the people of the region. In September 2006, Officer Gerardo Caravacal was ordered to investigate a local graveyard on the outskirts of Santa Catarina after a call from a member of the public reporting suspicious activity. Any eagerness that Caravacal had been feeling at the prospect of apprehending wrongdoers quickly dissipated, however, when he was further updated that the witness had reported seeing two witches flying around in the sky above the site. When Caravacal arrived at the entrance to the graveyard, he found the wrought iron gate securely padlocked, forcing him to exit his vehicle and proceed into the deserted location on foot. As he cautiously picked his way between the ornate crypts and tombstones, he was thankful that there was still some daylight. The prospect of wandering around in the dark was not one he relished. The officer had been investigating the scene for about 5 minutes when he had started to develop a strong feeling of anxiety. As he looked all around, there was nothing unusual to be seen, and yet he could not shake the sense that someone or something dangerous was lurking nearby. With a sick feeling, he came to a halt and slowly turned his eyes up towards the heavens. Directly overhead, about 100 feet up, a pair of dark figures hovered in the evening sky. Gerardo strained to make out any details on the entities, but could not tell what, if any, clothing they were wearing. He remained paralyzed by a consuming sense of dread, noting the two beings were completely immobile, remaining motionless in one spot as they looked down and regarded him. Suddenly there was movement, and the two figures started to descend slowly and purposefully towards him. As they drew closer, he was able to make out their molted and greying skin, long spindly fingers with sharp claws, and what looked like fur or feathers covering their bodies. With a shriek, Caravacal thumbed his radio and yelled for assistance, before turning on his heels and running for his life. He had heard the approaching sirens before he reached the gate, and turned to see that the figures were now rapidly rising up into the sky, leaving the scene. As the first of his colleagues reached him, they too could see two faint shapes gradually receding into the distance. The subsequent police report would make for disturbing reading, but it was by no means the most disturbing encounter that a Mexican police officer would have with these creatures. On the evening of January the 16th, 2004, another police officer by the name of Leonardo Santiago had been carrying out a routine patrol in the neighborhood city of Monterrey. He had been cruising through the silent suburban streets when, out the corner of his eye, he thought he had seen a dark form falling onto the ground, backlit by the street lamps along one of the side roads he had been passing. Santiago backed up his patrol car and turned into the street in question. His vehicle headlights immediately illuminated the shape that he had just seen and caused him to cry out in surprise. The object was apparently hovering in mid-air, having come to a halt about 1.5 feet where it should have made contact with the ground. But even more astonishing was the fact that it was slowly unfolding before his very eyes into an elongated humanoid figure. The officer stared in utter bewilderment at the entity, which was now standing fully upright, seemingly trapped within the powerful high beams of light that his cruiser was projecting. It was dark in colour, covered from head to toe in some form of leathery skin, and he thought he could detect the outlines of female features. But it was the creature's eyes, or rather lack of eyes, that were the most disturbing. Two empty, hollowed-out sockets were located where the eyes should have been. The unending darkness they exhibited seemed to transfix him, drawing his gaze and preventing him from turning his head to look away. The apparition stared at him for what seemed like an eternity, its face remaining oddly expressionless, before it uttered forth an inhuman scream and launched itself towards him. Santiago attempted to throw the cruiser into reverse, but the creature slammed into the car's bonnet with unbelievable ferocity. The impact immediately propelled the vehicle backwards several feet. The police officer screamed out in terror, finally managing to find the correct gear and accelerating backwards at great speed. On the bonnet of the car, the creature howled again and pounded on the metalwork, leaving sizable dents and deep scratches. As the cruiser hurtled backwards out of the side street and onto the main road, Santiago slammed down hard on the brakes in a concerted attempt to dislodge the attacker, but it stubbornly maintained its grip on the vehicle's bonnet. He desperately started to fumble for his sidearm, but with incredible speed, the creature was up and pressed against the windscreen, howling at him with unrestrained anger through the toughened glass. The car was now rocking wildly from side to side as the nightmarish figure rained blow after blow down upon it, continuing its relentless attack. Repeatedly failing to unholster his weapon, Santiago was helplessly thrown around in his seat, until his head finally impacted on the doorframe, knocking him out cold. When he came to, he was surrounded by other officers, trying to find out what had happened to him and why the police car was in such a state. Unsurprisingly, Santiago's emotional and somewhat disjointed explanation for what had taken place during the encounter failed to satisfy his superiors, who ordered that he be subjected to a battery of both physiological and psychological assessments. where none of these produced any evidence of impairment, and there were other subsequent reports from local residents that strange figures had been witnessed moving back and forth in the skies above Monterey, he was quietly reinstated back to full duty. It's perhaps human instinct to dismiss these two fantastical accounts of ineffectual police officers, perhaps trying to cover up for their own misdeeds, particularly in the absence of any corroborating evidence. But unlike the majority of other reported supernatural encounters, the flying humanoids of South America is a phenomenon that has stubbornly persisted in the face of growing technological advancement. There is a wide and colourful variety of arguments and theories regarding who or what these strange visitors may be, with proposals ranging from wildly fantastical to far more ordinary alternatives. It's also thought that as these sightings and encounters continue to occur with such a high level of regularity, it may not be long before hard evidence becomes available to provide much needed credibility to these speculative explanations. Many commenters elect to go back into the distant past, delving into the histories of Mexico's original Aztec and Mayan cultures for answers. These two ancient societies have managed to retain a frustrating level of mystery and secrecy, despite having been subjected to a high level of scrutiny over the passage of time. Intriguingly, both are civilizations which elicit multiple references to awe-inspiring gods and monsters, as well as stories about human beings who somehow gained the ability to fly. Given the particularly monstrous and unnatural descriptions of these creatures which were encountered by the Mexican police officers, parallels have been drawn with the Mayan demigod Camatoch, a flying being with a bat-like appearance, who would routinely descend from the mountainous regions to terrorize the local populace. Conversely, the Aztec people worshipped a powerful being named Quetzalcoatl, who was nicknamed the God of the Wind. Their texts and manuscripts describe him as resembling a feathery serpent, but interestingly, they also make reference to the fact that he derived his ability to fly through a magnetic amulet that he wore around his neck. Could it be that the creatures such as these, who were once worshipped as deities by our ancestors, were in fact some form of hybrid or cryptid, the offspring of which are now beginning to emerge and encroach on a burgeoning modern-day society? Legends persist that the ancient tribes who originally settled in the South American continent were in fact the beleaguered survivors of Atlantis, and were able to salvage some of their technology and knowledge from the decimated underwater kingdom. Some commentators believe that the architecture of the towns and cities was designed to be navigated and accessible from the air, as it was from the ground, as flying machines were readily available and in regular use. The town of Quimbaya is located in the northwest of Colombia, and has been the site of a number of significant archaeological relics. In particular, a series of golden jewellery pieces, which date back to 1000 BC, and bear a striking resemblance to modern-day jet aircraft, have been recovered there. These miniatures possess what appear to be cockpits, wings and tail fins, and in some cases propellers. In 1994, German aeronautical engineers even managed to create working prototypes based on the pieces, which were deemed fully capable of flight, assuming there was an accompanying power source. It's further argued that it's not just the depths of the ocean where this mysterious technology may have originated from, but also the far reaches of outer space. Commonalities in the architecture and writings of ancient civilizations across distant reaches of the world have given rise to a theory that the Earth has been previously visited by extraterrestrial visitors. Artwork and drawings from all across the globe depict humanoid figures wearing odd-looking apparatus floating in the skies. Could it be that these ancient aliens are now returning to observe how mankind has evolved in their absence, or indeed that they never actually left the Earth at all? There is of course the viewpoint that what is being witnessed and documented here is neither an ancient god nor an extraterrestrial visitor, but is instead a far more human undertaking. Investigators seeking to debunk the flying humanoid phenomenon have been keen to point out that the quality of video footage is never sufficient to make out any real detail, and that there are a number of terrestrial explanations. In urban areas, it is possible that silhouettes seen travelling across the horizon are in fact devices used in the construction industry that move along wires and carry materials between tall buildings. It had also been argued that the shapes can easily be recreated by using novelty balloons or by tightly securing bundles of normal balloons together. These may have escaped from public functions or even been deliberately released in an effort to create the hoax. One of the most frustrating and undermining elements of the story of these South American flying humanoids is the different ways in which the people who have been involved have interpreted what they have seen. To some witnesses, these figures are monsters or cryptids. To others, they are demons or witches. And to others still, they are aliens or time-travelling humans. Rarely has a phenomenon been so open to interpretation. What we are faced with is compelling eyewitness testimony, but frustratingly poor quality evidence, which can easily be pivoted or angled to support either of the opposing viewpoints. What is not a matter of debate, however, is the absolute terror which these sightings continue to evoke, or the regularity with which they occur. Whatever is taking place in the skies above Mexico and its neighbouring countries, it has shown no signs of abating and will undoubtedly continue to provoke arguments for and against for some time yet to come. The countries, cultures and people of South and Central America are amazed and beautiful in their own right. There are many fascinating places to visit, but there's also no denying that some of these regions can be fraught with danger. If ever you venture out that way, of course be vigilant, but also remember to look up every now and then. Bedtime Stories.
For more than a century, a steady stream of treasure hunters and thrill seekers have lost their lives under mysterious circumstances whilst searching for a legendary cache of gold, hidden away somewhere in central Arizona. The headless bodies of those that have eventually been located have made it clear that there is something in the mountains. It was customary for April to be one of the hottest periods of the year for the state of Arizona, but even taking that into account, the weather conditions for 1958 seemed unusually unforgiving. Daytime temperatures had not dropped below 30 degrees Celsius for the past 2 weeks, and as Benjamin Cruz slowly laboured along the mountain track, he found himself silently praying for rain. There was no obvious shelter for miles around, and the light and heat from the sun directly above him was relentless. The Pinal County Sheriff's deputy came to a halt again to take yet another gulp of water from his canteen. A gentle shake of the container as he finished drinking confirmed it was nearly empty, but thankfully he was carrying a spare. When he had set off from their patrol car back on the main highway, his partner Joe Donaldson had insisted that Cruz take his along too. The decision for Deputy Donaldson to remain at their vehicle with the hikers who had called for police assistance had not been a difficult one. As soon as the officers had pulled up, it was clear from the haunted expressions on the faces of the two youths that they would be little more than a hindrance if they were to show them the way. Cruz had seen their kind 100 times before, dumb college kids, heads turned by stories of hidden gold and ghostly Apache guardians. Rather than endure another hour of their nervous babbling, he had made them repeat the directions to the location they had called about until he was satisfied they were not lying, and then moved off up the mountain's northern slopes. Approximately half an hour later, Cruz found what he was looking for. A short distance off the main trail, hidden from sight behind a small outcrop, were the dusted remains of a campsite. The deputy produced a pencil and notepad from his breast pocket and then slowly walked around the perimeter of the scene, noting down the details he felt were pertinent. A gun cleaning kit lay discarded to one side, its scattered contents forming a wide circle of metallic debris. On one hand, the absence of any spent shell casings was reassuring, but the fact that the weapon the kit was intended for was missing was conversely a concern to him. Despite all the sand and particulates that had evidently blown into the location over the past few days, it was clear that some form of violent confrontation had taken place. Deep scuff marks and divots were still evident on the ground, the remains of an evening meal strewn haphazardly across them. Cruz had watched enough corny B-movies to recognise a Geiger counter when he saw one, but whilst its presence intrigued him, that was not the item which held his attention. Several feet away from the camp, snagged on a nearby bush, was a military-style sleeping bag. The deputy approached it cautiously, wincing when he caught sight of the dark blood staining that had saturated its interior. Having bent down to retrieve a few pieces of correspondence, all of which had any identifying names or addresses torn away from them, he used his walkie-talkie to send Donaldson back into town to fetch more officers. He then settled down on a nearby rock, sighing wearily before lighting up a cigarette. The remains of the campsite's owner would turn up at some point in the future. They nearly always did. Hell, he thought to himself, if they were really lucky, then this time, the head might even still be attached. The Superstition Wilderness Reserve dominates a huge swath of the land lying to the east of Phoenix, Arizona. It is named after its highest peak, the Superstition Mountain, a 3,000-foot monolith located towards the south. Rarely has a geological feature been so aptly named, as even before Western settlers eventually stepped foot in the region, the indigenous tribes residing there regarded the location with an uncomfortable blend of fear and reverence. The Apache people swore that the mountain was home to a vengeful thunder god, who resided deep within the caves and tunnels. Only through regular worship and sacrifice could he be persuaded not to rise and decimate the lands around his lair. In addition to this, they further believed that concealed somewhere within the bowels of the mountain range was a bottomless portal, leading straight down to the depths of hell itself. Or rather, the Apache equivalent. But it was whispered tales of underground cities of gold that caught the attention of the conquistadors who arrived in the area during the 1540s. The Spanish forays into the foothills and valleys around the mountain brought them into direct confrontation with the Apaches, who warned that only misery and death awaited those venturing into the kingdom of the Thunder God. Plentiful seams of gold were soon discovered, but extracting this great wealth came at a terrible cost. Almost immediately, decapitated and mutilated bodies of the soldiers who had been sent to mine the bounty were recovered, their steel breastplates and matchlock rifles little match for whatever mysterious force guarded the treasure. As their numbers dwindled, the Spanish made the decision to leave the region, but the lure of the gold would prove impossible to resist for many others. Over the centuries, many adventurers would return to the Superstition Mountains in search of the hidden fortune, meeting with varied levels of success. But it would not be until the 1840s that a permanent mining facility could be established. The influential Peralta family conducted operations in the hills for many years, until the Apache massacred them and their workers as a warning for others to stay away from the sacred grounds. In time, the Peralta mine was forgotten until a US Army doctor by the name of Abraham Thorne wandered into Phoenix carrying a knapsack full of gold ore. He claimed to have lived among the Apaches for a decade, studying their culture in exchange for the provision of basic medical care. Thorne stated that out of gratitude for his services, he was blindfolded before he left and led to a deep mine shaft where he was allowed to take as much gold as he could carry away with him. The abandoned gold mine was rediscovered in the 1870s by a German prospector called Jacob Waltz. He refused to reveal its location, regularly venturing off alone into the mountains and returning with large amounts of gold. Records show that he sold a total of $250,000 worth of the precious metal to the US Mint before he passed away in 1891 following a bout of pneumonia. In the years following Waltz's death, there were many attempts to locate and claim the seam he had been working on, which became known, despite the fact Waltz had been German, as the Lost Dutchman's gold mine. And as those who set out into the mountains in search of the mine failed to return, the story gradually evolved from a local legend into a national obsession. The first recorded death related to the mine came in 1896. An outlandish character named Elisha Rivas relocated from California to the Superstitions and built himself a cabin up in the mountains from which to operate in search of the gold. Rivas was something of an eccentric, refraining from shaving or cutting his hair, and often wandering the canyons buck naked, brandishing a pair of revolvers. His antics apparently led even the Apaches to give him a wide berth. When his battered body was eventually found lying 4 miles away from his shack, the head had been carefully placed upon a rock several meters away from it, looking down at the rest of his remains. An adventurer by the name of Adolf Ruth announced his intention to locate the Dutchman's mine in June of 1931, and after equipping himself with a large amount of provisions, he too disappeared off into the wilderness. The following December, his skull was located by a search party that had been hired by his family in a vain effort to find him. The cause of his death was not overtly difficult to deduce, with 2 large bullet holes torn into the centre of the forehead. It would be a further 4 weeks before the rest of Ruth's remains were recovered. A decapitated corpse was found several miles away, identified as the missing man due to the presence of metal pins inserted into one of its 2 crushed and broken legs from a previous fall. The coroner ruled that Ruth had committed suicide when he had been unable to walk any further. This proved somewhat unconvincing for the family, who were keen to stress that Ruth would not have been able to shoot himself in the head twice, and that no gun had been recovered. Equally as disturbing was the death of treasure hunter James A. Cavey in July of 1947. He arranged to be transported into the mountains by helicopter, establishing a base with 2 weeks' worth of supplies in La Barge Canyon before setting off on foot in search of the gold mine. When the helicopter pilot returned 2 weeks later, finding all the supplies untouched and no sign of Cavey, he immediately alerted the local sheriff. A posse was organised, assisted by tracker dogs, but it would not be until the following February that a party of hikers found Cavey's remains, rolled up in a blanket and left hanging from a ledge by a rope that had been tightly tied around them. Once again, the head had been removed, and several ribs were broken. Cavey's identification papers, clothing and money were all left in a pile nearby, with a rock placed on top to stop them from blowing away. The mysterious slayings have continued, with the most recent being that of a 35-year-old Colorado native in December of 2009. Jesse Capon was utterly obsessed with finding the Lost Dutchman's mine, and had made multiple trips to the Superstition Mountains before he disappeared. A search by the local police found his car abandoned on a remote track, with a phone and wallet still inside. Jesse's broken and shattered body was recovered 3 years later, wedged in a crevasse halfway down a sheer rock face, which was inaccessible from above. There was no indication of how he had come to rest there. Other strange phenomena have also been reported by people visiting the Superstition Wilderness Reserve, including phantom orbs of light flying around in the skies overhead, and sightings of a tall skeleton-like figure making its way across the plains at night, searching the ground for something with a flickering lantern in its grasp. Bedtime Stories was first alerted to the myths and tales associated with the superstitions by a subscriber, Nathaniel Allori. He contacted the channel to share a disturbing story that had taken place when he had been hiking in the region back in 2015. He and a number of friends had happened across wreckage relating to a light aircraft that had crashed there during December of 2011, killing its 6 occupants. The group decided to take a rest at the crash site, and whilst doing so, Nathaniel took a number of pictures on his mobile phone. A week after he had returned home from the trip, as he was showing his mother the photos he had taken, she had gasped and pointed to something in the shot that was standing a short distance behind the group. When Nathaniel zoomed into the image in question, he was bewildered to see what appeared to be a male figure dressed all in white, staring directly into the camera approximately 15 meters behind the group. The figure in question had not been there on the day the photo was taken, and in any case, there was no way it could have been where it was. His group was on its way back from an area that only had one access route, one way in, one way out. For the figure to have been standing behind them, it would have to have walked past them first, yet no one saw it. Whoever the figure is, it is not defined clearly enough to identify, but on closer inspection, it does appear as though the skin is charred. There have been in excess of 100 unsolved murders and unexplained deaths which have been documented within the boundaries of the reserve over the last century, the overwhelming majority of which were people who had been searching for the Lost Dutchman's gold mine. So who or what is it that so fiercely and effectively guards the location against avaricious intruders? Apache writings make reference to a race known as the Tortums, underground dwellers who could occasionally be glimpsed at the top of mountain ridges, peering down at travellers who were entering their territory. Few native warriors encountered these creatures and lived to tell the tale. It is of course easy to dismiss such a story as being far too fantastic to be true, except for the similarities it bears to another mysterious mountain region. The idyllic Nahanni National Park is located in Canada's Northwest Territories, but is also known by another, far more sinister nickname, the Headless Valley. Much like the superstitions, it was home to a tribe of Native Americans, the Dene, until the beginning of the 18th century, when rumours about deep seams of gold attracted large numbers of prospectors and treasure hunters. In 1908, 2 brothers named Frank and Willie McLeod disappeared whilst prospecting in an area of the park known as the 200-mile Gorge. Over a year later, the decapitated bodies of the 2 men were discovered in undergrowth a short distance from Virginia Falls. Their heads were never located. A decade later, the charred remains of another prospector named Martin Jorgensen were found in his burned-out cabin, again minus the head. The Dene lay the blame for the killings firmly at the door of a supernatural race known as the Naha, fierce ghost warriors who covered their faces with nightmarish masks and took the heads of their enemies as trophies. In addition to the murders, the bodies of frozen campers have also been found next to burning campfires, which should have kept them alive. And of course, there have been persistent reports of UFO activity in and around the valley. The Apache belief that the Superstition Mountains hide a portal which descends directly into hell is also far from an isolated one. Tales of these so-called hellmouths can be found in the history of cultures from all over the world. One of the most famous is said to be located 50 kilometers north of Prague in the Czech Republic. During the 13th century, it was written that winged demons were terrorizing the area, and knights dispatched to find them stumbled across a gaping chasm, which the creatures were using to emerge from hell. Hoska Castle was allegedly built on that spot to seal the portal and prevent any further incursions by these entities. Again, it is easy to scoff at what amounts to a medieval ghost story, but the manner in which the castle was constructed does set it apart from similar fortifications of the era. It was built in an isolated area, well away from existing roads and supply routes, and all the battlements and walls were inward facing, with no external defences. It was also designed with no kitchen or sleeping quarters to support a permanent garrison of defenders. Whatever truth may or may not lie in these two legends, the fact that some of the victims were killed with modern firearms suggests that the answer to the mystery is a far more rational one. In 1945, a treasure hunter called Barry Storm claimed to have survived an encounter in the mountains with a mysterious sniper, who he referred to as Mr. X. Storm stated that the attacker had stalked and taken shots at him for several days, before he had finally managed to escape. He would go on to write a book about his experience, in which he theorized that the same individual may have been the killer of Adolf Ruth 15 years previously. Given the lengthy passage of time over which the murders have occurred, it seems inconceivable that one such killer could exist. This in turn leads to the theory that there may be a secretive organisation or cult that continues to exploit the wealth of the Lost Dutchman's mine, one that is prepared to go to the most extreme lengths in order to prevent the precious resource from falling into the hands of others. As with any of the stories we examine, the truth naturally rests somewhere between these more outlandish theories and far more mundane explanations. A large percentage of the deaths that have occurred are most likely the result of murder, suicide, fatal accidents, or natural causes. The perceived decapitation or mutilation of the remains can further be attributed to the body being left out for a sustained period in such a desolate and unrelenting environment. But dead bodies being degraded by animals or harsh weather conditions cannot fully explain away the more bizarre fatalities that have been reported. The fact that such a high number of these unexplained cases have occurred at both the Superstition Mountains and the Nahanni Valley make it clear that hostile adversaries dwell within the mountain ranges of the North American continent, and that they are best avoided at all costs. In time, it is possible we may yet discover what is responsible for the Superstition killings. Until then, our thoughts are with all those who have perished in pursuit of the Lost Dutchman's mine and the families they left behind. May they rest in peace. Bedtime Stories.
Hello, and welcome to Scaryside. The entity. I can't remember my exact age, maybe around 7 or 8. I can recall my family and I moving into a new house. It took a little while for us to get settled into the new place. It was a lot bigger than our previous home, which was only a 2-bedroom apartment. It was nice, but something about it gave me the creeps.
There was lots of extra space to explore, and I had a bigger bedroom, which was great. Or so I thought at the time. A few months had passed, and things went on as usual. That is until I began having nightmares. At first, they happened every once in a while. I remember brushing it off at the time because I believed nothing bad could come out of it. Then it began happening more and more frequently as time went on. So much so that I dreaded going to bed at night. Bedtime became a nightly battle with my parents, and I'm sure it was driving them up the wall that I had become so difficult. My mistake was not telling them about it. They merely thought I was going through a rebellious stage. That wasn't it. I became so paranoid that when the evening hours would set in, I couldn't handle it if I wasn't near some sort of light. Going to sleep every night was awful for me during this time of my life. One time specifically, I remember not even knowing I was in a nightmare. As far as I knew, I was in the living room watching TV with my father when he said it was time to wrap things up and head to bed. I begged him to stay up a little longer because just the thought of being in my bedroom at night terrified me. I soon realized that my pleas were to no avail, as my father gathered my things and began walking me down the long, dark hallway. It felt like pure doom was waiting for me in the darkness. As we approached the door to my bedroom, I couldn't help but to stand there, petrified, not knowing whether or not something could be potentially in there lurking around. The idea of that sent a bolt of fear down my spine. In that moment, I let out a loud scream as I watched a long, black, shadowy limb grab me by the arm, pulling me violently into the darkness. I immediately sat up in my bed in a cold sweat, heart racing, screaming and crying, realizing that it had all just been a bad dream. My mother racing to my bedside to see what was wrong and comforting me. During these kinds of episodes, her attempt at comforting me did not ease my fear. It felt too real this time. Unfortunately, these nightmares continued over the next 2 years. Fast forward a bit, and the conversation about moving again was brought up. I remember feeling excited about getting out of the house we were currently in, thinking maybe it's the house that's causing these horrible nightmares. Within a few weeks, we found a new house, and we moved yet again. The first day at the new house, I thought to myself, this house seems cheery. It definitely has a much more pleasant vibe to it. And for the first several months, the nightmares seemed to let up. I was sleeping normally again. There was a lot less stress at bedtime, which seemed to make my parents a bit more relaxed. I still hadn't opened up to them completely as to what had been going on with me, although my mother seemed to have an idea. Either way, life felt easy again. I was a lot happier. I didn't feel like a dark cloud was hovering over me all the time anymore. I thought I would never have to deal with that stuff again. Things were going great, until it happened. This one remains etched into my memory like no other. It was a normal night. I went to bed. While I was lying there, I noticed a red light which began to dimly light up my dark bedroom. I slowly turned over to see where the source of the light was coming from. My door was slightly cracked, and it seemed to be coming from the hallway. That's when I saw it. A tall, black, smoky-edged entity with a wide-fanged smile and glowing white eyes standing at the foot of my bed. I froze in absolute terror. I saw its long arms and claw-like fingers hanging beside its massive body. thinking at any moment this thing was going to shred me to pieces. I slowly sat up, not wanting to provoke it by making any sudden movements, and I just stared back at it in utter horror. It felt like an eternity. I then noticed it slowly tilt its head to the side. I couldn't hold it in anymore. I screamed at the top of my lungs and pointed at it. My mind became clouded with pure fear. I could do nothing but point at it, stare, and scream. When I saw my mother the next morning, the first thing she said was, "How are you feeling today, honey?" I hadn't remembered any of it and had no idea what she was talking about. My mother, looking at me with confusion, said, "You don't remember what happened?" I told her no and began asking her questions. She seemed hesitant at first to tell me anything, but I wouldn't drop it, and she finally caved. She began by saying she had never witnessed anything like it in her life and was frightened beyond belief. It was the middle of the night, and she was asleep in her bed when all of a sudden she was startled out of her mind to the sound of blood-curdling screaming and crying. She rushed into my room to find me sitting upright in my bed, eyes wide open and filled with tears, and pointing into the doorway. When she tried to comfort me and ask me what was wrong, I wouldn't answer her. There was no consoling me. She didn't know what to do except keep her arms wrapped tightly around me. She then said that after a few minutes of trying to calm me down, I abruptly fell limp. My arm dropped from where it was, and my frightened eyes became heavy. I then softly told her I had a bad dream before collapsing peacefully back into my pillow and sleeping as though nothing had even happened. At that moment is when I started to remember the horrific night I had. It all came rushing back to me. These nightmares, which eventually evolved into night terrors, went on for a few more torturous years. I never really talked much about it, but my mother helped me through those times as best she could. They eventually stopped. I'm a lot older now, and very thankful these horrible visions came to an end, completely. Those years were rough. Seeing that dark entity in my room, time and time again, utterly traumatized me. For many years, I couldn't stand going into dimly lit or pitch black areas. I always had to have a nightlight well into my teenage years. Luckily, I have grown out of that, and those times are far behind me. But I just want to know why it was the same nightmare, the same entity that stared at me. Why it all started after moving to that one house. What caused this? It felt so real. Was something actually visiting me? I will always wonder. If anyone has ever experienced something like this before, we would love to hear about it. Please comment or email us at scarysidetales@gmail.com. And don't forget to subscribe if you enjoyed the story.